week we speak to Leith Van Onselen, macrobusiness.com.au. It's where we get our financial and economic news each day. Brilliant. macrobusiness.com.au. Leith Van Onselen is on the line. Good morning.
G'day, Luke. How are you?
Very well, mate. What about you? Long weekend doing something wonderful or not?
Mate, the weather's turned pretty miserable down here in Melbourne, unfortunately. We had an absolute fool's paradise spring, whereby I reckon about 4 weeks ago I was actually swimming at the beach, which you never do in Melbourne.
Yeah.
At this time of year, but suddenly it's just hit us, punch in the nose. So unfortunately, mate, it's going to be a bit wet and a bit cold. So I'll probably just stay indoors and do some other stuff.
Yeah, nothing wrong with that. Now, you say that the government, returned for now a couple of weeks. Already we should be getting policy whiplash. Why do you say that?
Yeah, so this week, early this week, I should say, it looked like the Albanese government was going to make some sort of sensible policy compromises in a bunch of areas, but later in the week, they pretty much have done a 180-degree turn, it seems, and have fumbled the ball. So, the first area is gas, right? So, I discussed it in detail last week that it appeared that Labor was open to establish an East Coast gas reservation policy, effectively, emulating the excellent policy that the coalition took to the election. Now, I'll just give a very quick refresher, so in case you missed last week, the Rod Gillard government in the early 2010s made the disastrous decision to approve LNG exports out of Gladstone, Queensland, without requiring gas producers to supply the domestic market first. And because this effectively made East Coast Australia the only place in the world, the only gas exporting jurisdiction that doesn't require companies to supply their own residents first, so domestic reservation policy. And since then, since these export terminals booted up about a decade ago, we've literally doubled the production of gas on the East Coast, but we've actually supplied 25% less gas to the domestic market. So I've just siphoned it offshore, right?
Yeah.
And as a result, the East Coast gas price has roughly tripled. And the coalition promised during the election to implement an East Coast reservation policy by imposing export levies on uncontracted gas. So effectively, gas does not own a contract, which goes in what's called the spot market, which is actually what helps set the electricity price. They were going to force that gas to be supplied domestically rather than export, and they're going to do it by basically charging an export levy on that gas to make it more cost prohibitive to export. So it was excellent policy. And the coalition promised to lower the East Coast gas price to below $10 a gigajoule. So currently it's around 12, floats around 12, goes up a bit, whatever. But the counterfactual of not doing this, Luke, is because we've got these gas shortages, these artificial shortages, we're actually looking at importing gas in New South Wales and Victoria and potentially South Australia. So these LNG import terminals, if they come online, they're going to push up the price of gas on the East Coast to possibly $20 a gigajoule from 12 currently, because we'll be paying import parity prices. So that's effectively the price we pay at the moment is basically export parity prices, which is before you got a liquefier, which uses tons of energy and is expensive, the cost of transport, and then converting it back into gas at the other end. So we'd be basically paying that extra cost. And so the coalition promised to implement a reservation policy. Now, Labor's resource minister Madeleine King during the election dismissed the coalition's policy as a quote thought bubble. And so that basically, they effectively opposed it. But last week, the AFR reported that the Albanese government was considering imposing an East Coast reservation policy. So that basically got me pretty excited. I thought, here we go. Labor's, bending the knee and coming back to common sense.
Yes.
But then late this week, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese distanced himself from the notion of reservation, and despite the fact that he publicly praised Western Australia's gas reservation policy. So Western Australia's a separate gas market. It's not linked by pipeline. They've had a reservation policy since the early 2000s that's brought down the cost of, gas and electricity in Western Australia. It's worked excellently. So Albanese said, WA, this is a quote, WA frankly showed good vision going forward when they put in the reservation. So he said it's a good thing. But then he said that the coalition's policy had been plucked out of a Cocoa Pops packet and said that Labor already has the power to force producers to sell to the local market. Well, if you do, why?
Yeah, we'll do it then.
Exactly. So, unfortunately, this is a sort of whiplash. It looked like coalition is an excellent policy. It got lambasted during the election for political reasons. It looked like last week Labor was going to bend the knee and potentially do a similar policy. Now Albo's come out attacking the coalition's policy or reservation, saying it was plucked out of the Cocoa Pops packet. So the upshot is that if we don't do this work, if Labor doesn't fix their stuff up from under the Rudd-Gillard government when they approve these projects without reservation, we're facing the very real prospect of having to import LNG, which is going to send the gas price through the roof. It's going to send electricity prices higher. It's going to push up inflation. It's going to lead to higher cost of living concerns. And it's obviously going to push more on manufacturing offshore because we won't be able to make stuff as nearly as cheaply because energy is arguably the key input if you're a manufacturer.
Yeah.
And if we make that energy expensive, we send our manufacturing offshore, we get a less diversified and industrialised economy, and the manufacturing will end up just going to China, which is where we sell a large chunk of our coal and gas anyway. So it's just crazy stuff, mate.
So what about superannuation? Whiplash again?
Yeah, it does. So under Labor's proposed super reforms, they want to effectively increase the earnings tax on large super balances. So that's balances over 3 million. And I don't personally have a problem with that necessarily, provided it's indexed. But the real controversial area here is they want to change the rules. So at the moment, there's a 15% super tax on earnings within super funds. That's like dividends and interest payments, and if you've got a commercial property rent, etc. And they want to increase that to 30%, which for large balances is fine. I don't really have a problem with that. But the problem is they want to start applying it to unrealised paper profits, which is crazy. So what that means is that if you've got a share portfolio and the share portfolio rises in the year, they want to start taxing that before you've even sold it. And it's a real problem, particularly if you hold unlisted assets. So if you hold assets that are not traded on a share market, for example, like commercial property or whatever, how do you value that? So they need to basically get a private valuer in. That's all rubbery valuations anyway, and then you need to pay tax every single year on whatever this person deems that it went up before you've actually sold it. And then if you don't agree with it, you're probably going to spend thousands of dollars for an alternative assessment. It's just a whole bunch of complexity that we don't need. And Prime Minister Anthony Albanese suggested early in the week that Labor would negotiate with the coalition instead of the Greens and raise the prospect that it would abandon its unrealised capital gains component. But instead, good old Treasurer Jim Chalmers on Wednesday came out and then slammed the door on that, saying, no, Labor's going to negotiate with the Greens. We're going to keep the unrealised tax on, and we're going to basically keep the existing policy, which is subject to balances of $3 million, but it's not indexed. So what that means is that in, say, 25 or so years, if you've got inflation at 2.5%, that 3 million balance in 25 years will be equivalent to, say, 1.5 million in today's value. So it's going to suck more and more people into that net. For starters, it should be indexed, and they should get rid of the unrealised component. And I think if they did that, we'd probably have a good policy, because the reality is the superannuation concessions are ridiculously generous, and they do cost the budget about $60 billion currently. So it is very expensive. They're forecast to grow to cost the budget more than the age pension in several decades. So we should really, raise a bit more money out of that stuff, but it should be done properly. And the way you do it is you just simply double the tax for large balances, you index it. What we could also do is we could change the way concessions are taxed. So at the moment, when you contribute to your super fund, you do it at a flat 15% tax. Now, there are some carve-outs if you earn over 250K, but for most people, it's 15% flat tax on super contributions. Instead of doing that, what that does, that means that if you're on a higher income, you get a bigger concession. So, for example, if your income's $220,000, your marginal tax rate 47%, but if you pay 15% contribution, effectively getting the tax benefit 32%. Whereas if you're at the lower end, you don't get as big a benefit because your marginal tax rate's lower. So instead of, if you want to make that more, I guess, sustainable and also fair, just follow the Henry Tax Review's recommendation, which is basically give a 15% flat deduction. So for any superannuation contribution, you pay it at your marginal tax rate minus 15%.
Yeah.
And that way you'd be giving a bigger benefit, effectively a bigger benefit to lower income earners, so than they currently get.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't be giving as big a benefit to high income earners. And ultimately, the superannuation system should be about relieving pressure on the age pension. And the way you do that is, instead of giving heaps of concessions to people who would never go on the pension anyway, you could skew that to the lower end. And if you did those two things, the government would save billions of dollars in more revenue, it'd be a fairer system, and we'd have more money to cut income taxes and do other stuff. But Get rid of this unrealised gains. It's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous. I had a listener say earlier, if you have an unrealised gain, you should pay the tax with unrealised income, which I thought was a nice way of dealing with it. Now, do we have a clown or hero? I think it's a clown this week. Is that right?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'd love to do a hero, but
yeah, okay. Well, look, just let me play the music first. So there we go. All yours, mate. Clown of the week.
Yeah, as I said, mate, I'd love to do a hero, and I will one day, but unfortunately we've got another clown, and unfortunately it's none other than Treasurer Jim Chalmers. So
oh, no.
This week we got the Q1 national accounts, so the March quarter national accounts released from the ABS, and it was another absolute shocker, right? So we're back into per capita recession. Economic growth, once you subtract population growth, fell by 0.2%, right? So we went backwards again. This represented the 9th decline in 11 quarters. So this is the longest stretch of per capita declines in modern history. It's not the deepest. It was deeper in the early 90s and the mid-80s recessions, but it's the longest we've had. So we've just been at this slow grind. So 9 out of 11 quarters we've gone backwards. We've suffered a per capita GDP decline of 1.7% over that period. Also, the total economic growth in the March quarter was 0.2%. That's with population growth. But that was less than half of what the RBA projected in last month's statement of monetary policy. They projected 0.45%. So it's a really weak result. And, good old Treasurer Jim Chalmers put lipstick on a pig. He did a media release saying that the private sector recovery we have planned for is gradually taking hold. The Australian economy remains, quote, one of the strongest in the world. Now, the hilarious thing about that is private sector recovery. Public demand, so that's basically public spending as a share of GDP, is basically at its highest level ever, of nearly 29%, and about 60% of the nation's growth in the year to March was from public spending. So we've basically got an economy here where the private sector is dead. It's been propped up by high population growth, high public spending, and then Treasurer Jim Chalmers is saying that we've got one of the strongest, economies in the world, etc. So, it's very hard to take him seriously when per capita GDP, so everyone's slice of the economic pie, has fallen for 9 out of the past 11 quarters. And we've also experienced, household spending has also declined for 7 consecutive quarters on an annual basis. It's down about 2.5% from its peak. So households are spending less as well. And we all live in the household economy, Luke. So there's 3 parts of the economy. You've got household, businesses and government. We care about the household sector, and that sector particularly has been hit very hard. And we care about that because that's the sector that we all live in. Everyone listening to this is part of the household sector. We're not, part of government, we're not part of business. And that sector's been hit really hard. We're all cutting back on spending. We've got a per capita recession, and Jim Chalmers is out there with a media release saying Australia's economy remains one of the strongest in the world.
Yeah, give us a break.
Kind of ridiculous.
It is. All right, mate. Have a great weekend. I'll talk to you next week.
Cheers, Luke.
Thank you, Leith Van Onselen. And just to support what Leith was saying about the private sector, I found this astonishing. I really did. The Don Watson Group, which look after transportation and cold stores, they've decided to shut their doors. Now, this is a highly regarded company. It's a refrigerated logistics operation, so it sends around the country frozen and cold goods. Now, you would think, given the distance, that they would have great demand for their services. Well, it started back in 1948. The founder, Don Watson, would service markets with a few Army surplus K-Series Austins. He passed away in 1973. His son took over, and they launched the refrigerated division in 1984. And there's a third generation owner now. Well, they're shutting up shop. Final collections made tomorrow. And then they'll be delivered in the following days. The thing is, there's 300 employees. Now, they'll be paid their entitlements, I'm told. But it's purely down to economic conditions. That's what they say. Now, I'm sure they didn't by accident last so long from the original founder to the refrigerated division founded in the 80s. I'm sure they didn't get through all that by accident. Something's going on here, and Leith is so right. For the Treasurer to say, look at me, how good. Remember we had that conversation about lived experience, and then we get, the fluff and the spin and the statistics that are meant to look this way, not that way. This is lived experience. I hope all the people working for that company are okay. And to think that they've got a shot after being founded in 1948, delivering cold stuff in a country our size, astonishes me. Next, we won't be able to make things here. Oh, hang on. Back in a moment.